Hi, class. So, in this segment, I'm going to talk to you about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So, if you've been watching the other lessons of the French Revolution, which hopefully you have been, then you know we've been through parts of the French Revolution of 1789. We've gone over the old regime. We've looked at the failed meeting of the Estates General. We've also looked at some of the activities of the National Assembly. But I really didn't talk in detail about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is a major document having to do with the French Revolution. And I think that this document really has a lot to say about both what the French revolutionaries were looking for in 1789, what their goals were, and it kind of foreshadows in a way where the revolution is going to go. So let's go ahead and go into it. So, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was passed by the National Assembly on August 26th, 1789. And this really laid out that's what it was, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. We're taking France, which had been an absolute monarchy before this, and for the first time, we are outlining a plan for constitutional government and principles of constitutional government based on the natural rights of man, and for people not just being subjects of a king, but citizens of a nation. Now, in order to understand this document and this the meaning of this document, I think you really have to look at the influencers, like who is really influencing the creation and the writing in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. So first, I'm going to call your attention to Thomas Jefferson, who was the author of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. You know, he was very much a crusader for liberty, and he was also at the time the US ambassador to France. So he would have been in contact with some of the people who were writing this document. But we also have to take into account the Enlightenment philosopher Jean Jacques Rousseau, who was a Frenchman. Now, while Jefferson was a classical liberal, and this means in all cases he was really a champion of individual rights and seeing government more than anything as, you know, kind of like this John Lockean construct of protecting natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So now, while Jefferson is a classical liberal, and because of him, we're going to get that voice, this classical liberal of emphasis on the individual. Rousseau, on the other hand, is going to place some emphasis on not only individualism, but also what I may refer to as radical democracy, that is focused on government as an instrument of the general will, right? The general will, as in the public, the common will. So, what we're going to see here in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is kind of a dialogue between Jefferson, who is the champion of individual rights, and Rousseau, who in a lot of ways symbolizes the general will and that form of government as far as an upholder of majority rule. Now, some people refer to Rousseau as a sort of proto-socialist. Now, people who are really familiar with Rousseau say that this idea, this opinion is based on a very simplistic reading of Rousseau, that people who say this don't really understand Rousseau or his writings. But then you would ask yourself, what about the people writing this document, this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen? Were they necessarily big time Rousseau scholars, or were they really just people who had a casual interest in Rousseau and picked and chose what was best for them and what fit to their program? And I think you're going to look and find that the latter is true. So at this point, let's go ahead and look at the document, and we're gonna look at the document itself, and let's see where we see Jeffersonian individualism and liberalism, and then where are we going to see Rousseau's emphasis on democracy and the general will. And you've got to keep in mind that these two aren't always going to play well together, because although we technically, typically in our society, we think of democracy as being synonymous with freedom, it really isn't. Just ask Socrates. Remember the story we learned about Socrates, the philosopher, in our unit on ancient Greece? You remember he was forced to drink hemlock, a poison, and died after he was accused and sentenced to death in a democracy for supposedly corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing strange gods. So democracy isn't always necessarily synonymous with freedom in that way. So just keep that in mind. This tension between the individualism and individual rights of Jefferson and this more kind of proto-socialist, some sort of mentality that you're going to see creep in here now and then from Rousseau. All right, here we go. We've got the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and it begins with a preamble, as most documents do. It says, the representatives of the French people, constituted as a national assembly, and considering that ignorance, neglect, or contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of public misfortunes and governmental corruption, have resolved to set forth in a solemn declaration the natural, inalienable, and sacred rights of man, so that by being constantly present to all the members of the social body, this declaration may always remind them of their rights and duties. Now you see here, first of all, you see Jefferson, okay, that when we forget about the rights of man, and all kinds of misery will start, right? It says that there, contempt of the rights of man are the sole causes of public misfortunes, right? But then we also saw some things about members of the social body. And we not only saw rights discussed, which is the language of Jefferson, but also something that we don't see as much in American documents, the duties. Do you see that word there? The duties, okay? So the rights of citizenship and the duties of citizenship. And really that's an influence from Rousseau. And a continuation of this preamble, it says, in consequence, the National Assembly recognizes and declares in the presence and under the auspices of the Supreme Being the following rights of man and citizen. So it's basically saying, as a result, because of what we just said, we are declaring under the presence of a Supreme Being the following rights of man and citizen. So notice the invocation of the Supreme Being here. We see this language of deism, much like we saw in the U.S. Declaration of Independence when we talked about that during our unit on the Enlightenment. And deism, it's not necessarily the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the Christian God, Jesus Christ, anything like that. But deism is referring to this Supreme Being. This is civic deism, as we see in a lot of Western societies today. So you can see here this graphic on the right. Deism is the belief in the existence of a supreme being, specifically of a creator who does not intervene in the universe. Deists believe that God does not intervene in human affairs, and they do not accept miracles or supernatural revelations. So it's a belief in a higher power, but it's not a specific higher power. They don't necessarily believe in the Christian God or the Muslim God or the Jewish God, right? Now we're going to look at the specific rights and duties that are listed, right? So they said that's what they were going to write about, and this is the first one. It says, first off, men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be based only on common or public utility. Now keep in mind, this is kind of a play on Rousseau, whose book, The Social Contract, which we talked about, begins with the sentence, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So these people are taking it a step further. According to them, men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. That perhaps we can set up the type of social contract that will guarantee freedom. And then when we see that social distinctions can be based only on public utility, we see that in societies such as the United States or any other society where you have leaders. So, for example, if the president of the United States comes into the room, you would show respect. You would refer to him or her as Mr. or Mrs. President. They have a title. There's all kinds of ceremony and pomp and circumstance that surrounds the president. Not necessarily because of the circumstances of his or her birth or anything like that, Um, it's not because he has the title of nobility or anything like that, but because he holds an office that we deemed to be important. And he got that office because he was elected by a majority of the people. So we do have social distinctions in modern free societies. That's what this is saying here. But they are not because of hereditary nobility. They are not passed down from father to son or mother to son, right? We have these social distinctions, these titles, and they're there because they benefit the public, and it's not passed down from family in between family members, right? That's not how this works in democracies. These titles are earned, right? So that's the influence of Rousseau there. 2, it says the purpose of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imperceptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Now, of course, we see some Jeffersonian language here, right? 3, the principle of all sovereignty rests essentially in the nation. No body and no individual may exercise authority which does not emanate expressly from the nation. Now, you see here that we see a reference to the nation, which is part of the whole idea of the French Revolution, turning France from estates into one single nation. No first estate, no second estate, no third estate, no hereditary nobility, protection for the church, anything like that, but a full nation. Now, keep in mind, too, that sovereignty resides in the nation, which is kind of more of a Rousseau kind of construct than a Jeffersonian one. And if we think of sovereignty in the United States and where that resides, we would say that sovereignty resides in the Constitution, right? That our public officials swear an oath to the Constitution when they take office, not necessarily the nation, which is really kind of vague. And if you take that too far, it leaves room for some of the heads to be rolled later on, that sort of thing, right? Now, number 4, it says liberty consists in the ability to do whatever does not harm another. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no other limits than those which assure to other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by the law. 5, the law only has the right to prohibit those actions which are injurious to society. And here in these points, we see Jefferson's influence, the Jeffersonian classical liberalism, that the function of government is only to keep me from hurting someone else. That if I am doing anything that does not hurt someone else, then that is none of the government's business. That the government can only step in if someone is doing something harmful to someone else. That is the principle of classical liberalism that generally says when it comes to politics, society, the economy, that government should stay out unless some legitimate harm is being done to someone. Now, number 6, the law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to take part in person or by their representatives in its formation. It must be the same for everyone. Now, you see Rousseau stepping in again here. That law is an expression of the general will. And so far we've seen, all right, so the law can only step in when people are hurting each other or to keep you from hurting someone else. That if it doesn't hurt anybody, it's none of your business. That's what we've gotten from Jefferson. But then we see here that law is an expression of the general will, which when you take that into account, well, what if the general will is to say that I shouldn't do something? Or something like that. This is the language of democracy, which doesn't necessarily have any liberal values attached to it. Think about the idea of majority rule and how that could become dangerous. Just because we're in a democracy, right, and you have a majority of the people voting for something, that doesn't mean that's always okay, right? Maybe a majority of the people want to vote to infringe on the rights of the minority, right? We see this it becomes a dangerous thing. There's something called mob rule, and we're going to see that this is what ends up taking place in France. And this is coming from Rousseau. Okay, so you can kind of see here there are some contradictions in this document, that we have this dialogue between Jefferson and Rousseau, and they're not always saying the same things. And if we go on and we look more at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, we see some things that really sound a lot like the US Bill of Rights, that, no one can be accused, arrested, or detained except, determined by law, due process, and all that kind of stuff, and that people should be able to express their opinions. Now, when you look, though, more closely at number 10, we see here that it says no one should be disturbed for his opinions, even in religion, which this sounds like the U.S. Bill of Rights, which says that Congress shall not make no law respecting the establishment of religion, abridging the freedom of speech, all that kind of stuff. But when you look closely here, it says, provided that their manifestation does not trouble public order as established by law. And this leaves a little bit of room for interpretation, that you have a right to your free opinion, even in religion, as long as it does not subvert the public order. So whereas in the Bill of Rights, you see that you have a right to these things, period, right? You have right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, period. And then to be able to assemble peaceably as long as you're not doing violence or something like that, right? But there's nothing there that says that, oh, well, your opinions violate the public order or something like that. Like, that's not in the Bill of Rights, right? There's not that qualification there. So you see some room here in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen for the role of government to increase beyond what these people may have envisioned it increasing to. And it kind of foreshadows the reign of terror in a few years, right? So it kind of suggests that there is a standard for religion and opinion and speech, and that it's possible for people to be prosecuted for having some opinions, or taking actions that might subvert the public or violate the public order. So although it looks as though it's similar to the Bill of Rights, is actually slightly different when you take a look at that second half of that sentence there. In many ways, it leaves open the possibility for abuse from the government, which we will talk about in the Reign of Terror in upcoming lessons. And I'll post the rest of this document on Google Classroom if you want to keep reading it on your own. But I think that you have gotten, the gist of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is really to articulate the values of the French Revolution. Jeffersonian liberalism and, sort of a Rousseau, almost democratic, maybe in some ways almost proto-socialist mentality coming in. So you're already seeing that the French Revolution has a little bit of an identity crisis. What are the values of the French Revolution? And this is going to really, in most cases, articulate the liberalism of the beginning of the French Revolution, but also to foreshadow the radicalization of the French Revolution, which is based on a simplistic reading of Rousseau. So hopefully you understand that a little bit better. You can kind of understand where we are going. And as far as where we're going in this unit, the next lesson is on the civil constitution of the clergy. And that this is also very important because it is sort of a transition from the liberalism of the early French Revolution to the more collective proto-socialist reign of terror that's going to come later. So I hope you'll keep watching the Edpuzzles. Let me know if you're confused about anything or if you need any help. That's what I'm there for on Google Classroom and our Google Meet, is to help you. So thank you so much for watching.